Good morning. Here is today's word of blessings for you. Judges 19:1-5. In those days Israel had no king. Now a Levite who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But she was unfaithful to him. She left him and went back to her parents' home in Bethlehem, Judah. After she had been there for months, her husband went to her to persuade her to return. He had with him his servant and 2 donkeys. She took him into her parents' home, and when her father saw him, he gladly welcomed him. His father-in-law, the woman's father, prevailed on him to stay, so he remained with him 3 days, eating and drinking, and sleeping there. On the 4th day they got up early and he prepared to leave, but the woman's father said to his son-in-law, "Refresh yourself with something to eat, then you can go." Today's title is Israel Had No King. The book of Judges is one of the most ancient chronicles of Israel. It painstakingly recorded the backsliding history of the people of God who settled in the land of promise. These were God's chosen people whose ancestors went through the Exodus and wilderness. Then what happened to the people of God? Why did the Israelites go through so many pains and turmoil for hundreds of years throughout the era of Judges? The book of Judges gives us a clear answer to such questions. The 2 most frequently repeated phrases in the book of Judges carry the answer. One of the 2 phrases is "everyone did as they saw fit." The second phrase is "in those days, they had no king." Today's passage again starts with the repeated phrase "in those days, they had no king." The following episode of disorderliness and mayhem is the proof text for the disastrous result of having no king. This episode will end up in heartbreaking wars between brethren and a huge loss of lives. Today's passage covers the beginning of the great tragedy. It starts with a Levite who lives in a remote place in the hill country of Ephraim. We all know that the Levites were the tribe that served at the tabernacle of God. Their lifestyle ought to manifest the fear and love of God. But this Levite who lives in a remote place took a concubine from Bethlehem. The Levite was unfaithful to God. So what? We'll see. It seems to be a wrongful act of a nameless individual initially. But you will be marveled at how such a seemingly insignificant act will be escalated into a great tragedy for the whole country. As the Levite was unfaithful to God, so the concubine became unfaithful to him. The 2 unfaithful will fall into the hands of an even more unruly and unfaithful mob, and so on. So what is the root cause of all these unfaithful acts and the painful loss of lives as a result of it? It was in those days. They had no king. They had no king because they deserted the king. They had no king because they themselves became king. The lack of king to fear resulted in disorderliness and unfaithfulness. It maybe started at one remote place and one nameless person. But it spread like a wildfire. The fire destroyed the whole country. What if they had a king? The fear and love of the king would keep people's life more orderly and peaceful. The king would have intervened in the calamity before it would spread wildly. So who is the king? Who else but the king that brought them out of Egypt and led them through the wilderness and fought with them in conquering the land of promise? Bring back the king. Live with the king. Even the stones of the hill country must have shouted. And finally, the king has returned. Do you know the king? Do you have the king?